The snow had been falling for 3 hours before she found him, and by then it covered everything in the kind of silence that made other species feel safe. She stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the cabin through the blizzard. Small, 1 story, a curl of wood smoke from a chimney, a single light in the window, amber and low, the kind of light that suggested domesticity, warmth, the vulnerability of a creature that needed fire to stay warm. She had studied the briefing materials on her transit down, 12 light minutes of compressed data relayed from the survey team that had been mapping this region for the past 4 of the planet's years. The species was called human, bipedal, fragile endoskeleton, lifespan of approximately 80 cycles under optimal conditions. No natural armor, no venom, eyesight mediocre in low-light environments. The survey team had classified them as a Category 2 species, potentially adaptable as a labor resource but not capable of organized resistance beyond tribal aggression. Category 2. She had done this before, 7 worlds, 7 Category 2 species. None of them had ever surprised her. She adjusted the restraint collar at her wrist, checked the signal on her locator beacon. The one she'd already tagged her target with while he slept, 3 nights ago, a microscopic transmitter pressed beneath the skin just below his left ear and walked toward the cabin. Her name, in her own language, was a sequence of harmonic tones that no human larynx could produce. She had been using the designation that the survey team gave all field agents on low-resistance worlds, Ren, clean, simple, easily pronounced. She had used it enough times now that she almost thought of it as real. She knocked. The sound of boots on a wooden floor, then silence, then the kind of stillness that preceded a door being opened by someone who had checked through the window first. The door opened. A man stood in the frame. He was not what she had expected. The survey team's records on Marcus Vale listed him as 37 years old, formerly employed by the United States Navy in a special operations capacity, currently residing alone in a structure registered to his deceased grandmother. He had been selected for the acquisition sequence not for anything remarkable about him, but for the opposite reason. He was isolated, apparently without close social contacts, and had not interacted with his surviving family in nearly 2 years. He was, in the survey team's phrasing, an uncomplicated retrieval. The man standing in the doorway was 6 feet and change, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness in his body that she associated with large predatory animals rather than prey. He had a short beard, dark with a thread of gray at the jaw. His eyes were a pale gray-green. He was looking at her the way she had learned to look at things she didn't immediately understand, without expression, processing. He was also, she noted, barefoot in what was effectively a blizzard doorway, and he didn't seem to notice the cold. "You lost," he said. His voice was flat and even, not unfriendly, not the warmth of a creature opening its door to a stranger in a storm, something more measured than that. "My car went off the road about a mile back," she said. She had the language perfect, the survey team's linguists were excellent, and she had calibrated her cover with care. A passing traveler, a woman alone in a storm, nothing threatening, nothing that would trigger the territorial instincts she'd read about in the briefing. "I've been walking. I didn't know anyone lived out here." He looked past her. Not over her shoulder, actually past her, scanning the tree line, the road, the spaces between the pines. It was a specific and practiced movement, and she filed it away. "Come in," he said and stepped back. The cabin was smaller inside than it had looked. A single large room with a kitchen on one end, a wood stove in the center, a narrow hallway leading to what she assumed was a bedroom and a bathroom. A workbench against one wall with tools organized on it in a way that suggested precision rather than habit. No television. A bookshelf with actual physical books. She had read about the paper media fetish some isolated humans maintained. A folding table with a topographic map spread on it, held flat by a coffee mug and a compass. She sat in the chair he gestured to, near the stove. He brought her a towel without being asked. She took it and pressed it to her hair, which was actually wet from the snow, a detail she appreciated about the physical cover. He didn't sit. He leaned against the kitchen counter and watched her. "You want something hot," he said. "Please." He turned to put a kettle on, and she used the 4 seconds his back was to her to complete the primary assessment. He moved like someone who never fully stopped watching a room. The turn was economical. It kept his peripheral vision on her. He didn't rummage. He knew where everything was in the dark. This was the point in an acquisition where she would typically begin conditioning the target. Simple techniques, most of them. Suggestion, social pressure, the gradual erosion of the subject's sense of their own judgment. With Category 2 species, it usually took between 4 and 12 hours. She had done it faster. The record on her 7th world had been 90 minutes, a leader of considerable local status who had melted like ice in a forge the moment she applied the right emotional leverage. She looked at Marcus Vale's back and started running the standard opening sequence in her head. He set a mug in front of her, tea, she hadn't specified. "You said your car went off the road," he said, sitting down across from her now. "Where exactly?" "On the highway, about a mile, maybe a mile and a half." "Which side?" She had studied the maps. "North side." "In the ditch near the guardrail." He nodded slowly. "That stretch doesn't have a guardrail." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You've been out here before," she said. "I run that road every morning," he said. "In the dark mostly, know every inch of it." He picked up his own mug and held it in both hands. "So, what are you actually doing out here?" The interesting thing, she would think later, was that she didn't panic. Panic was a Category 1 response, a survival reflex from species that hadn't developed enough neural complexity to override instinct. She was well past that. She recalibrated quickly, fluidly, the way she'd been trained. "I came to see you," she said. "Okay." "I'm doing a survey, population study." "Remote demographics." She watched his face. "There are a handful of people living in isolated conditions in this region. You're one of them. We're trying to understand why people choose." "Who's we?" Another flat question, delivered the same way as the first one. No hostility in his voice. No heat. Just an absolute refusal to accept anything he hadn't asked for. She had never had to improvise this fast this early. The protocol for a blown cover was established. Neutralize, extract, move to the next candidate. She had 3 other targets in this region. She would simply. "You put something under my skin," he said. She went very still. "3 nights ago," he said. "I woke up at 300 because something woke me, and I couldn't see anything wrong, and then I lay there for a while and did a body check the way I was trained to do, and eventually I found it. Little bump just under here." He touched the spot below his left ear with one finger. "Took me another night to get it out. It's in a jar in the kitchen. I was wondering when someone was going to come about it." She looked at him, he looked at her. "You know what it is," she said. "No," he said, "but I have some guesses." "What kind of guesses?" He set his mug down. "The kind that would sound crazy to most people. I've been in situations that would sound crazy to most people. After a while you stop caring how it sounds and you start caring about what's accurate." She studied him. The conditioning had already been partially running, the low-frequency harmonic she could produce at the back of her throat, calibrated to create unease, suggestibility, a generalized lowering of the subject's confidence. She had been running it since she sat down. Most Category 2 subjects showed signs within 5 minutes. Fidgeting, avoidance of eye contact, a tendency to defer. Marcus Vale had not fidgeted once. He was maintaining eye contact the way she maintained eye contact, as a deliberate tactical choice rather than a social reflex. "I should explain what I am," she said. "That would be helpful." She let the physical cover drop. Not entirely. The human form she was wearing was partially biological, partially structured light, and the full release of the structured light architecture could be startling to Category 2 nervous systems. She let enough of it fade that the eyes changed. Pupils that weren't quite round, iris color that shifted from the brown she'd calibrated to something cooler, the faintest luminescence in the sclera. He watched her do this. His expression didn't change. His hands didn't move. "Oh," he said. "You're not frightened." "I'm a lot of things," he said. "I'll work through them in order." "Most subjects," she stopped. She had said subjects. She watched him file that word away. "Most subjects what?" "Most people," she corrected, "react differently." "How many people have you done this with?" She didn't answer. "On this planet or elsewhere?" She looked at him carefully. He had arrived at the extraterrestrial question, not with disbelief, not with the performative shock she had learned to expect from Category 2 cognition, but with the kind of patient, logical extension of available evidence that she associated with significantly more advanced species. "Elsewhere," she said, "and here, your world has been under survey for several years." "Survey for what?" "Resources, population assessment." She was recalibrating even as she spoke, not abandoning the mission parameters but restructuring the approach. The conditioning wasn't working. The extraction protocol required her to bring the subject to a state of manageable compliance before the physical component could proceed. She had a secondary technique, a more direct one that she'd used twice before. It required physical contact. She had the reach. She was stronger than she appeared. The protocol was to create a distraction, close the distance, apply the nerve compression. "You should know," he said, "that I have about a dozen different ways to hurt you from where I'm sitting, and I've been thinking about which one makes the most sense for the last 10 minutes. She was silent. "I'm not going to do anything yet," he said. "I'm still curious. But I want you to know the option exists, in case it affects how honestly you answer my questions." "You can't harm me," she said. "My physiology." "I don't know your physiology," he said, "but I know a pressure point is a pressure point, might work differently on you, might not work at all, but I've had worse odds." He picked up his mug again. "What are you actually here to do?" The honest answer was, extract you, condition your mind until what remains is a functional biological unit capable of simple labor tasks, ship you off-world with 40,000 other specimens from this region, as part of the acquisition sequence that has been running on this planet for 4 years. She had never said those words out loud to a subject. There was no protocol for that. "I'm here to assess you," she said, "for relocation." "Against my will." "The concept of will as you understand it." "That's a yes," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You have a beacon on you," he said, "something that tells your people where you are." It wasn't a question, but she answered it, "Yes." "And if you don't check in, what happens?" "A retrieval team is deployed." "How many? What kind of equipment?" "Why would I tell you that?" "Because," he said, with a patience she found genuinely unsettling, "I've been alone in this cabin for 2 years, and in that time I've done a lot of thinking about threat assessment and contingency planning, and right now you're either going to help me understand what I'm dealing with or I'm going to have to figure it out by myself after this conversation ends a different way." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm asking you to help me. That seems like a better deal for both of us than the alternative." She was quiet for a long time. The wood stove ticked. The snow pressed against the windows. She ran back through everything she knew about Marcus Vale from the survey briefing. 37 years old, former Navy SEAL, 6 combat deployments across 4 different conflict zones, record classified at the highest levels of his government's military apparatus, decorated multiple times in ways that apparently could not be discussed publicly. She had read those details the way she read all the details in a briefing, as context, background, the color on a painting she was not particularly interested in. She cared about psychological profile, social isolation, susceptibility markers. She had not thought to ask what a Navy SEAL was. "What did you do?" she said. "In the military." "Whatever needed doing," he said. "That's not specific." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him and understood, for the first time in 7 worlds, what it meant to have a gap in her intelligence. The survey team had flagged Marcus Vale as an uncomplicated retrieval, isolated, low social connectivity, apparently adrift. She now understood that they had read those characteristics correctly and drawn entirely the wrong conclusions from them. He wasn't adrift. He had come here deliberately. He had stripped away everything that could be used as leverage: friends, family, the social texture that made most subjects manageable. And he had been living in this cabin with a topographic map, and a compass, and 12 years of training that she didn't understand and apparently had not thought it necessary to understand. "The retrieval team," she said. 3 operatives, standard non-lethal equipment. They deploy in approximately 4 hours from the point of missed check-in. He nodded. "The beacon," she said, "is a 2-way transmitter. If I send a specific signal, it will trigger early deployment." "You won't do that." "Why not?" "Because you're still gathering information," he said. "Same as me." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. Not admiration. She did not admire Category 2 organisms. But something adjacent to respect, the way you might feel respect for a piece of terrain that turned out to be more complex than your maps indicated. "Ask your questions," she said. "Why this planet?" "Water biomass. Your atmospheric composition is compatible with several client species. Your population is large enough to support a long-term labor surplus without triggering a collapse of the biosphere." "How many planets have you done this to?" "In my operational career, 7. The acquisition program is older than my career." "How many of those worlds fought back?" She paused, none successfully. "But some tried." "Yes." "What happened to them?" "Suppression operations," she said. "Rapid and complete." "How rapid?" "Measured in your planetary days, not years." He absorbed this, set his mug down, stood up. She watched him move to the workbench. He had his back to her. The second time he'd done that, she realized, and both times it had felt less like vulnerability and more like demonstration. "He knows I'm watching. He's not afraid of what I'll do." He came back with a small glass jar and set it on the table between them. Inside it, swimming in what looked like rubbing alcohol, was the locator beacon, less than 2 millimeters across. She would never have been able to find it by touch. He had found it by touch. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that however you answer it, I'm going to know if you're lying, because I've spent a long time getting good at knowing when people are lying to me." "Ask." "Is there any version of this where we make a deal?" She looked at him. "What kind of deal?" "You tell me everything about the program. Timelines, numbers, locations, equipment, weaknesses. I do whatever I can with that information. In exchange, I don't hurt you tonight." "That's a very asymmetrical offer." "Yes," he said. "Most good deals are asymmetrical. Somebody's always getting the better end." "And you believe you're offering me something I want?" "I'm offering you a way through tonight that doesn't end with you in a worse position than you're in now," he said. "That seems like something worth wanting." She thought about the retrieval team, 4 hours out. She thought about the 7 worlds she had worked before this one. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a room with a creature that had extracted a 2-millimeter transmitter from beneath its own skin by touch, in the dark, without tools, after waking from sleep with nothing but the faint wrongness of a bump it shouldn't have been able to feel. Category 2, the briefing had said. She was beginning to think the survey team had made a very significant error. "What would you do with the information?" she said. "One man alone in a snowstorm." "I don't know yet," he said, "but I've had worse starting positions." She believed him. She didn't want to believe him. Belief implied something about his chances, and what she had been trained to understand about Category 2 species was that their chances were, by the point of active acquisition, effectively zero. The conditioning program was designed specifically to close the window between initial contact and organized resistance. By the time a Category 2 population understood what was happening, the acquisition was typically 70% complete, and a 70% complete acquisition had never been successfully reversed. But 70% complete assumed the conditioning was working. She thought about the low-frequency harmonic she'd been running since she sat down, the technique that had an average take time of 5 minutes across 7 worlds. She had been running it for almost an hour. Marcus Vale had not shown a single sign. "Why didn't the conditioning work on you?" she said. He looked at her. "Is that what that sound is?" "You can hear it." "I can feel it," he said, "like tinnitus. I've had tinnitus since a training incident in 2009. I know what inner ear disruption feels like. I compensate for it." He paused. "Is that what you've been doing this whole time?" She was quiet. "Huh," he said, for the second time, the same flat, assessing syllable. He sat back down. The storm was getting louder outside, or the world was getting quieter, one of those two things. "Tell me about the retrieval team," he said. She told him. She told him because the alternative was to try the direct technique, which required closing a distance of approximately 6 feet, and she found herself genuinely uncertain about what would happen if she tried to close that distance. She was faster than him. She was stronger than she appeared. But she had been running her conditioning harmonic for an hour on a subject who had identified it as tinnitus and compensated for it. And she was sitting across from a person who had extracted a microscopic transmitter from under his own skin, and was now asking her about the retrieval team's equipment with the same calm tone he'd used to ask if she wanted tea. She was not frightened, she was revising. She told him about the retrieval team, 3 operatives as she'd said. Non-lethal primary equipment. The acquisition program discouraged physical damage to specimens, as damaged specimens had reduced labor value. Each operative carried a compliance emitter with a range of approximately 15 meters, a device that overwhelmed the nervous system of most Category 2 organisms and induced a state of involuntary docility within seconds. They also carried physical restraint equipment and a portable beacon relay. Their transport was a terrain vehicle capable of moving through the weather conditions outside. They would approach from the east, because that was the direction of the road. He listened to all of this without taking notes. She noticed that. No paper, no recording device. He was filing it directly. "The compliance emitter," he said. "How does it work?" "Electromagnetic pulse, specifically tuned to the resonant frequency of your nervous system's electrical activity. At close range, it creates an overwhelming override signal." "My nervous system," he said. "Most Category 2. But specifically mine." She understood the question. "We have biological profiles on all candidates. The emitter is calibrated to your specific neural profile." "You can do that?" "Yes." "Has it ever not worked?" She paused. "No." He nodded, stood up again. This time he went to the front window and looked out at the snow without pulling back the curtain. He looked through it, one eye to the gap where the curtain met the frame, the way someone looked through a rifle scope. "They come from the east," he said. "Yes." "How good are they?" "In a straight fight." "They're not trained for straight fights," she said. "The program doesn't anticipate them." "Because Category 2 species don't fight back." "Not at this stage." "What stage is this?" Initial contact, individual acquisition, the population doesn't know yet. He turned from the window. In the light of the wood stove, with the curtains still moving behind him, he looked different than he had when he'd opened the door. Something in his posture had shifted, not more tense exactly, more settled. The way a person looks when they've finished making a decision and are now simply waiting to execute it. "I want you to understand something," he said. "Tell me. I know this looks bad. You've got a program that's been running for years. You've got a retrieval team coming in a few hours. You've got billions of people on this planet who don't know any of this is happening." He said it without drama, just facts arranged in order. "I'm one guy in a cabin. I get that." "Yes. But I've been in rooms where it looked bad before," he said. "And the thing I learned every time is that the moment you start making decisions based on how it looks instead of what's actually in front of you, that's when you lose." She looked at him. "What's actually in front of you is me," he said, "and I've been thinking about this for the last hour. And I think I know how the next 4 hours go," he said. "I want to ask you one more time if you'd rather tell me what I need to know." "You keep asking me that." "I keep meaning it." She studied him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving the snow against the glass in long sighing waves. "They will neutralize you," she said. "The emitter." "Right," he said, "about the emitter." He went to the workbench again. She watched him. He came back with something she almost didn't recognize at first because it was so small and so precisely made. A Faraday cage, hand-constructed, copper mesh over a wire frame no larger than a paperback book. He set it on the table next to the jar with her beacon in it. "That won't block the signal," she said. "The emitter range and frequency." "I know," he said. "But you told me it works on my nervous system's specific resonant frequency. What I built is tuned to disrupt that frequency locally. It won't block the emitter. It'll introduce enough noise into my neural environment that the override signal won't find a clean target." She looked at the object on the table. She looked at him. "You built that," she said, "in the last hour." "I built it while you were talking," he said. "I'm good at listening and doing things with my hands at the same time." She was quiet. "The copper mesh is from the kitchen," he said. "The frame is lamp wire. I had to recalibrate it twice, but I think it's close enough. It won't be perfect, might hurt, but I've had worse." He tilted his head slightly. "You've been studying us for 4 years, you said." "Yes." "Did you study us before the acquisition, before the program?" "Extensive preliminary survey, 18 months. "And the things you found, the history, the conflicts, the wars?" "Yes." "Did it occur to anyone," he said carefully, "that a species that invents new ways to kill each other every generation might present a different kind of problem than the other Category 2s? Silence. "Our aggression metrics were flagged," she said finally. "The program's risk assessment team reviewed them. And the conditioning protocols were deemed sufficient. Based on 7 worlds. 7 successful acquisitions. How similar were those worlds to this one?" She didn't answer. "Different environments," he said. "Different evolutionary pressures. Different history. How many of those 7 worlds had spent the last 10,000 years in continuous organized violent conflict with other members of their own species?" She was very still. "None of them," he said. "It wasn't a guess." "No," she said quietly. "We are very good at war," he said. "We are very, very good at it. We have been practicing for 10,000 years and we are still practicing. We have people who do nothing else. We have institutions dedicated entirely to it. We have theory and doctrine and history and innovation, all of it pointed at the question of how to hurt things efficiently." He said this without pride and without aggression, simply as a person reciting a fact about the weather. "Your program has been running for 4 years. That's long enough for us to notice something's wrong. If one person noticed. You're one person. I was one person who woke up at 300 with tinnitus I'd never had before, he said. How many other people have you tagged? How many other people have that specific kind of tinnitus right now, lying in the dark, doing a body check the way someone trained them to do? She opened her mouth, closed it. The fire popped. Something in the chimney shifted. Outside, the storm was the whole world. You should go, he said. Now, before your team gets here. What? I'm giving you a chance to leave, he said. That's what I was offering when I said I wanted to make a deal. I was giving you a way through tonight. If you leave now, you can report back. You can tell them what happened here. You can tell them what the assessment got wrong. Maybe they'll listen. Maybe they'll call it off. Maybe they'll try a different approach. I don't know. He looked at her steadily. But if you stay here and your team comes, the way tonight goes is going to be very hard to explain to your program's leadership. She stared at him. You're warning me, she said. I'm being honest with you, he said, which is more than you were doing when you knocked on my door. She sat with that for a moment. You can't stop an acquisition, she said. Not alone, not with a copper mesh box and 4 hours of warning. I can stop this team, he said. Tonight in this specific location, with the information you've given me and the terrain I know and the 4 hours I have to prepare it. Can I stop the whole program? No, probably not tonight. But every journey has a first step and this is mine, and I'd rather you weren't here for it. He stood and opened the front door. The cold came in like a wall. The snow outside was thick and blue-white in the dark, the trees black against it, the night pressing in from all sides. He stood in the open door, barefoot on the wood floor, the cold apparently not reaching him, and looked at her. She stood. She walked to the door and stopped in front of him. This close, she could see the texture of the scars on his hands, old ones, not the clean surgical lines of medical procedure, but the jagged, arbitrary marks of things that had happened fast in low-visibility conditions. She could see the steadiness of his breathing, the way his eyes moved even in this moment, still doing the door check, still scanning, still the body of a person who had never in his adult life fully turned the watchfulness off. They won't stop, she said. Even if I go, the program doesn't stop. I know. There are things I can't tell you, resources you don't know about. You could be fighting this for years. I know, he said again. You might lose. Yes. Why are you doing this? He looked at her for a moment. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Because it's my world, he said simply. She stepped out into the snow. It was deep, past her ankles in the first step, past her knee in the second where a drift had gathered against the porch. She turned back once. He was still standing in the doorway, outlined by the amber light of the cabin, barefoot and apparently unbothered by any of it. If I report back accurately, she said, they'll send more than 3. Good, he said. I want them to take this seriously. She left. She walked back into the tree line, activated the emergency recall beacon on her wrist, and stood in the snow for the 3 minutes it took for the recall to register and a new signal to reach her. In those 3 minutes she reviewed, systematically, every assumption the survey team had made about this world, and found, one by one, that all of them were defensible on paper and catastrophically wrong in application. Category 2. She thought about the copper mesh box he'd built while she was talking. She thought about a species that had been at war with itself for 10,000 years, and what 10,000 years of war made you, and what it meant that an organization which had successfully acquired 7 worlds had walked into that history and called it uncomplicated. She began composing her report in her head. Her recall transport arrived 11 minutes later. She climbed in, and the door sealed behind her, and the storm disappeared below as the vehicle rose through the cloud layer into the cold dark above. Below, through the cloud cover, She knew that a man was moving through a snow-covered forest in the dark, preparing something she did not fully understand for a team that was already en route and had no idea what was waiting for them. She filed her report honestly. Her supervisors rejected it. An acquisition in progress was not suspended on the basis of a single field agent's assessment. The retrieval team was not recalled. A secondary team was dispatched as backup. 6 operatives now instead of 3. The compliance emitters were verified and checked. The biological profile on Marcus Vale was pulled and confirmed. The retrieval team reached the cabin at 4:12 local time. What they found there she didn't see directly. She was already 3 light minutes away when the distress signal came in, then 2 signals, then the silence where the 3rd signal should have been. The after-action report, when it was eventually compiled, used language she had never seen in 7 worlds of acquisition operations. Words like asterisk unexpected resistance and asterisk incomplete engagement and recommend escalating threat assessment. There were photographs. She didn't look at the photographs. She looked at the final line of the report instead, the one that someone senior had added, a classification note at the bottom. Species reclassification under review. Pending reevaluation of category assignments across active acquisition sites. She read it 3 times. Then she opened a new report and began writing a different document, not a standard field assessment, but something older in format, something she'd only read about, a template from the early decades of the acquisition program that had not been used in her lifetime because it had never been necessary. A warning flag, the kind filed when a new world pushed back. She wrote Marcus Vale's name at the top of it, and then she stopped and thought about that, about what it meant to put one human being's name at the top of a document that would change the classification of an entire world, and then she wrote it again and left it. Below, somewhere through the cloud cover, on a small rocky wet world at the edge of the spiral arm, a man was barefoot in the snow taking stock of what he had, thinking about what came next. She hoped, in a way she hadn't hoped for any Category 2 world before, that he had enough time. She suspected that was the wrong thing to hope for. She suspected he didn't need it. Far below, in a snowed-in cabin in Maine, a phone was ringing. The phone had been disconnected from the wall for 2 years. Marcus Vale had reconnected it an hour ago, while the alien woman was still talking, while he was building the Faraday cage with his left hand, and listening with both ears and thinking about all the things he still needed to do. He picked it up. "Yeah," he said. A voice on the other end. A former colleague. Someone who had also woken up at 300 with a tinnitus he didn't recognize and had done a body check the way they'd all been trained and found something wrong and spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what it was and had then started making phone calls. "How many?" Marcus said. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, "here's what we're going to do." Outside, the snow was still falling. The tree line was still dark. 3 miles east on the road with no guardrail, a pair of headlights moved through the storm, heading toward the cabin. Marcus Vale set the phone down, picked up the Faraday cage, checked the copper mesh one more time with the pad of his thumb, and walked to the door. He had been in rooms where it looked bad before. He opened the door and walked out into the snow. The cold didn't touch him. The dark didn't bother him. 10,000 years of human history moved in his blood like a tide, patient and specific and aimed. He had work to do. The first thing he did when he got back inside was move the kitchen table. He dragged it to the center of the room and turned it on its side, not because it would stop anything, it was cheap pine, the kind that splintered easily, but because it changed the geometry of the room, changed the angles. The retrieval team, according to what Wren had told him, would expect to find the cabin the way it had been when she left it. They had her sensor data. They had a floor plan, probably 4 years of survey work meant they'd mapped this structure down to the centimeter. They would know where the furniture was. They would have entry protocols built around that knowledge. He moved the table. Then he moved the bookshelf. Then he spent 40 minutes on the roof in the snow, in the dark, doing something with copper wire and the cabin's old AM radio antenna that he would have struggled to explain to anyone who hadn't spent time thinking about electromagnetic disruption. The compliance emitter worked on his specific neural resonant frequency. Wren had said it, a specific, targeted signal calibrated from his biological profile. The Faraday cage he'd built would introduce noise, probably enough to blunt the worst of it, probably enough to keep him functional, but probably was not the same as certainly, and he didn't like operating on probably. What he was building on the roof was different. Not a block, a mirror. Crude, improvised, the kind of thing that would make an electrical engineer wince, but the principle was sound. If you couldn't stop a signal, you could redirect it, bounce it back at its source. The effect wouldn't be clean, it wouldn't neutralize anyone. But it would introduce enough feedback into the emitter's own frequency that the operator would know immediately something was wrong. And an operator who knew something was wrong would hesitate, and hesitation was the gap he needed. He came back inside at 3:30, made coffee, drank it standing up. The phone call had been from a man named Devereaux, who had been in Bud S with him in another life, and had left the teams 4 years ago to run a security consulting firm in Colorado. Devereaux had called because Devereaux had done his own body check 6 weeks ago and found his own beacon, and had spent 6 weeks quietly and systematically finding other people who'd been tagged. People with the right kind of training, the right kind of history, the right kind of willingness to sit with information that sounded completely insane and treat it as operationally valid. He had found 31 of them. 31 was not nothing. 31 was, in fact, more than nothing by a significant margin, if the 31 were the right 31. And the 31 that Devereaux had found were very specifically the right 31. Marcus had listened to Devereaux read the list and thought about the acquisition program and its 7 worlds and its Category 2 assessments and its certainty, and he had thought, they have not run the numbers on this. An acquisition program that had run successfully across 7 worlds had presumably never encountered a world that was actively trying to acquire it back. That was the thought he was holding when the headlights appeared through the front window. 2 vehicles coming from the east. Moving slowly through the snow, the way vehicles moved through deep snow when they were heavy with equipment, possibly with personnel, possibly with something larger that he hadn't been told about. He picked up the Faraday cage, put it in his jacket pocket. The pocket sat over his left chest, over the heart, over the greatest concentration of bioelectric activity, the most likely target for a resonance emitter. He had lined the pocket with additional copper mesh while he was at it. Probably overkill, probably not. He turned off the cabin lights. In the dark he was fine. The dark was ordinary. He went to the back of the cabin, to the bedroom, to the window that looked out on the tree line to the north. Slid it open an inch. The air came in cold and clean and smelling of pine and snow. He breathed it. The vehicles had stopped 50 meters from the cabin. He could see the glow of their running lights through the snow. He watched the shapes emerge from them, 6, as Wren had said, 6 operatives with an additional team, moving in practice patterns, splitting into 3 groups, covering angles he hadn't fully addressed because he'd only had 4 hours. He let them get to 30 meters before he triggered the antenna array. The effect was not what he'd hoped for and better than he'd feared. There was a sound not loud, almost subsonic, a pressure more than a noise, and 2 of the 6 operatives stopped moving. Not fell down, not collapsed, just stopped, the way a person stops when a thought interrupts emotion. The other 4 continued. He was already out the back window. He had been barefoot earlier for Wren's benefit. It was a calibration, a way of demonstrating something about his relationship to the cold that he'd wanted her to register. He had boots on now, heavy ones. He moved through the snow behind the cabin, staying in the tree line, circling east toward the vehicles. The compliance emitters that the operatives carried were calibrated to his biological profile. That was a specific and important fact. It meant they were designed for him, which meant they were also limited to him. A signal tuned that precisely to one nervous system was not broadly effective. If it had been a general frequency emitter, he'd have had a much harder problem. As it was, the emitter would hit him and would try to find the resonant frequency he'd been tagged for, and it would find instead the noise from the Faraday cage and the reflected interference from the antenna array, and whatever happened next would be unpredictable, which was the best he'd been able to arrange. He reached the vehicles in 4 minutes. They were terrain vehicles, as Wren had said, large and armored in a way that didn't quite look like any terrestrial manufacturing he'd ever seen. The armor plating had a texture like compressed sand, and where the headlights hit it, the surface seemed to absorb rather than reflect. He noted this. He noted the access panels on the driver's side, the configuration of what he assumed were sensor arrays on the roof, the way the door seals worked based on where the light leaked. He had 2 minutes before the operatives, inside the cabin, realized he wasn't there. He used the 2 minutes. When the first operative came around the rear of the cabin looking for him, Marcus was crouched behind the second vehicle, and he had disabled the first one in a way that was going to be difficult to undo quickly. He didn't fully understand the vehicle's mechanics, but he understood the principle that if you introduced enough physical disruption into the part of a machine that moved, the machine would have difficulty moving, and the principle held. The operative was taller than he'd expected, wearing something that wasn't quite a suit and wasn't quite armor, with a helmet that covered the face completely, carrying a device in one hand that had to be the compliance emitter, roughly the size and shape of a flashlight, pointed at him. It activated. He felt it. It was bad. He wanted to be honest about that. The signal hit him like being grabbed by the inside of his skull, a pull that went straight through the copper and the noise and the interference and found something real regardless, some thread of his own nervous system that the emitter knew better than he did. And for approximately 4 seconds he was not fully in control of his extremities, and the world went gray at the edges, and he heard a sound like a television on a dead channel. 4 seconds. Then the Faraday cage did its job, or the antenna interference did its job, or the combination of both did enough of a job that the signal lost its grip, and the gray pulled back, and he was still standing. The operative, for its part, seemed genuinely confused. They had a biological profile. They had a device calibrated to it. Category 2 subjects were supposed to be on the ground by now. He hit the operative while it was still confused. He did not enjoy this. He had never enjoyed this particular aspect of the work, but he was not cruel about it, and it was over quickly, and the operative was not dead, damaged, probably, in ways he didn't fully understand because he didn't know its physiology, but not dead. He took the compliance emitter. The next 20 minutes were not clean. Clean was for operations with full intelligence and rehearsal time and a support element and a chain of command that knew where you were. He had none of those things. What he had was the terrain he'd been running for 2 years, and the darkness he'd been moving through for most of his adult life, and the 6-to-1 odds that were bad on paper, and somewhat less bad in practice, because 6 operatives built for retrievals in a known floor plan against a compliant subject were a different problem from 6 operatives against a target that had moved the furniture and booby-trapped the antenna, and was currently moving through the tree line with one of their own compliance emitters. He used the emitter twice. The second time was more effective than the first. He'd watched how the operative had aimed and held it and learned something from that, and the thing he'd learned was that the aim mattered less than the proximity, and proximity he could control. By 4:50 local time, the retrieval team was no longer operational. He stood in the snow and breathed. The antenna array had gone quiet. The vehicles sat dark on the road. The cabin was still intact, though one window had been broken in a way he hadn't anticipated. He would need to cover that before the temperature dropped further. He went inside and sat in the kitchen and drank the rest of the coffee, which was cold now. 31 people. 31 people who knew what he knew, who had the training he had, who were sitting in various rooms in various countries right now waiting for the phone to ring. 31 people who understood, without it needing to be explained, that you didn't wait for everything to be favorable before you started. You started with what you had. 6 operatives, 2 disabled vehicles, 1 compliance emitter confiscated, and the report that Wren had sent, which he hadn't known about at the time but which would, he suspected, cause some disruption somewhere in the hierarchy of an organization that had never had to revise a threat assessment mid-acquisition. He picked up the phone. "Devereaux," he said. Yeah, the voice was steady. Devereaux had always been steady. It was one of the things about him. "It started," Marcus said. A pause. "How bad?" "Medium," Marcus said. "For them. I'll tell you the details later. Right now I need you to start making calls." "Who first?" Marcus thought about this. He thought about 31 people with the right training and the wrong amount of information. He thought about a program that had been running for 4 years on a world it had misclassified. He thought about 7 worlds before this one, where nobody had built a Faraday cage. "Start with the ones who have the most questions," he said. "They'll adapt fastest." He hung up, looked at the jar on the table with Wren's beacon in it. He picked it up and looked at the small transmitter through the glass, less than 2 millimeters. He had found it by touch in the dark, after waking from a dead sleep, because something was wrong, and wrong was the kind of thing he didn't let go. He set the jar down and went to fix the window. Somewhere above the cloud cover, a recall transport was moving through the dark, and in it, a field agent named Wren was writing a warning flag that would reach her organization's leadership in approximately 6 light minutes, and would be debated and discounted and partially accepted, and then substantially accepted over the next several days, as more reports came in from more retrieval operations that had gone the same way this one had. The acquisition program had never filed a warning flag for a Category 2 world. This would be the first. Below the cloud cover, in a snow-covered cabin in Maine, a man finished boarding up the broken window with a piece of plywood he found in the shed, made a 3rd pot of coffee, sat down at the table with the topographic map, and began planning. He had 31 contacts. He had a confiscated piece of alien technology. He had 4 years of acquisition activity to reverse engineer from what Wren had told him, and Wren had told him more than she probably realized, because she had answered his questions the way a person answered questions when they were surprised into honesty. He had a cabin full of books, a compass, and 12 years of training in doing the worst jobs in the worst places with the least support. He also had something the acquisition program had not accounted for in any of its 7 previous operations. A species that had been studying war the way the program studied acquisitions for considerably longer and had gotten very good at it. He spread the topographic map and put his coffee mug on one corner to keep it flat. He started at the beginning. There was a lot of work to do. Outside, the snow was still falling. It covered the disabled vehicles and the marks in the snow and the window he'd repaired, and by morning the world would look like it always looked, white and quiet and empty, the kind of landscape that made other species feel safe. Marcus Vale drank his coffee and thought about the next step. Just the next step, that was all you ever needed. The rest would follow. He had been awake for 19 hours when Devereaux called back. "Got 18 confirmed," Devereaux said. "The others are dark, phones off, no contact. Could be they've already had visitors. Or they're being careful. Could be Vasquez is in. Myra's in. The 3 from second group are in, all of them. They've been comparing notes for a week apparently. They were just waiting for someone to call." Marcus looked at the map. Where's the geographic spread? Montana, Texas, 2 in the Pacific Northwest, 1 in Iceland of all places, the rest are scattered. A pause. Marcus, some of them found more than beacons. He was quiet. Vasquez found a monitoring station, Devereaux said. Buried, disguised as a telecom relay on her property in New Mexico. She'd been living 40 meters from it for 2 years. When she dug it up, he stopped. The data it was transmitting, population mapping, infrastructure analysis, behavioral pattern recognition on a scale that I don't know how to quantify it. She sent me the technical specs as best she could document them. It's beyond anything we build. Marcus said. Was beyond anything we build, Marcus said. Now it's a piece of alien infrastructure we've recovered. That's different. A longer pause. You want to study it? I want to understand it, yes. We're talking about going from defensive to something else entirely. We're talking about doing what humans do when they're threatened, Marcus said, which is adapt, learn. Build on what we've taken from the people trying to hurt us. He smoothed the topographic map with his palm. Devereaux, the survey team has been here 4 years. We don't know how many monitoring stations are buried around the world. We don't know the full scope of the tagging program. We don't know what the timeline is for the next phase of acquisition. He paused. But we have people who know how to find things out. We have people who know how to move quietly. We have, apparently, people who built monitoring stations we can reverse engineer. And we have one guy who spent a night winning a fight he had no business winning. I had a pretty good 4 hours, Marcus said. A short silence that was, for Devereaux, the equivalent of a long laugh. The Iceland contact, Marcus said. Name. Erickson, former maritime tactics, specializing in cold water operations. She's been maintaining her own surveillance perimeter around the monitoring station she found. Says she's documented 3 separate check-in cycles from the station over the past month. Regular intervals. Like clockwork. Then we know the schedule, Marcus said. And if we know the schedule, we know when it's vulnerable. You're talking about taking one of their stations. I'm talking about taking the data from one of their stations, Marcus said, and learning what they know about us, and using it. And if they notice the data's been accessed, then they'll know someone's home, he said, which they probably should. He looked at the jar on the kitchen table. Wren's beacon was still in it, still swimming in rubbing alcohol, less than 2 millimeters across. A microscopic thing. A thread of a signal reaching up through the cloud cover to wherever her organization's relays bounced it along to whatever infrastructure managed the whole program. A thread connecting this cabin to something that spanned light years and had eaten 7 worlds without pausing. He thought about what 7 worlds meant. He thought about the species on those worlds that had looked at what was coming and found it too large to fight. He thought about the specific categories of mistake that produced that outcome. The failure to recognize the threat early, the failure to act before the conditioning took hold, the failure to find the others who had noticed the same thing and build something from that noticing. He thought about 31 people scattered across a planet, some of them already dark, some of them building their own perimeters, some of them sitting at their own tables with their own maps and their own coffee going cold. He thought about a field agent writing a warning flag in a transport 3 light minutes above the cloud cover, composing, in a language he would never be able to read, the first honest assessment of this world that her organization had ever produced. Category 2. He almost smiled. Make the calls, he said. 18 is enough to start. Tell them it's not about winning yet. It's about not losing, staying alive, staying connected, staying in the fight until we know enough to win. He paused. They know how to do that. All of them know how to do that. What about you? I'm going to sleep for 4 hours, he said. And then I'm going to drive east and deal with 2 disabled alien vehicles before anyone local finds them. And after that, he looked at the map, at the topographic lines that described the land he'd been running through in the dark for 2 years, every stone and rise and hollow familiar to him the way his own body was familiar to him, the way the cold was familiar, the way the dark was familiar. After that, he said, "We start." He hung up. He finished the coffee. He washed the mug and set it on the drying rack the way he always did. He turned off the kitchen light. He sat in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the snow. It was possible, he knew this, held it clearly, did not look away from it, that it wouldn't be enough. That the program was too large, too old, too deeply embedded in the fabric of this planet's systems for 31 people and a warning flag and a confiscated emitter to matter. It was possible that the next phase of acquisition was already running, that the monitoring stations were already processing the data they needed, that the window was already closing in ways he couldn't see from a cabin in Maine with a cold cup of coffee and a topographic map. He held that possibility clearly and then set it aside. Because the other possibility, the one that lived in the copper mesh box and the antenna array, and the jar on the table and the phone call, and all the careful accumulated preparation of a 19-hour day, was this: that somewhere in the history of 7 conquered worlds there was an 8th, and on the 8th world there had been someone who woke up at 300 and did a body check and found something wrong, and that person had not been isolated, had not been dismissed, had not faced a retrieval team alone with 4 hours and a piece of lamp wire, and the 8th world had not been acquired. He didn't know if that world existed. Ren hadn't told him, and he hadn't thought to ask. But he was going to act as if it did. He went asleep. Outside, the snow fell, and the world was quiet and white, and looked exactly like what it was: a planet at the beginning of something that hadn't been decided yet. The vehicles sat dark on the road, already starting to drift over. The monitoring stations scattered across 4 continents continued transmitting, not yet knowing they'd been found. The field reports filed by 6 retrieval operatives lay in a database somewhere above the stratosphere, written in a language no human had yet read, describing an outcome that had no precedent in the program's long history. And in a dozen rooms in a dozen countries, people with the right kind of training and the wrong kind of tinnitus lay awake in the dark, waiting for a phone that was going to ring. It was enough. It was, for now, more than enough. It was a beginning.